welcome to another Scots Whay podcast. And today I'm joined by journalist and writer Alan Taylor to talk all about his new book, Edinburgh, the Autobiography, which is published by Birlinn. Hello, Alan.
Hi, Alistair. Nice to be with you.
So can you give us the reasons for this book and why now?
Well, I had done a previous book about Glasgow called Glasgow, the Autobiography. And my wife, Rosemary Goring, she'd done a book called Scotland, the Autobiography. And we thought it was kind of remiss that the capital had been ignored. Friends in Glasgow thought that was completely appropriate, of course. And I enjoyed doing the Glasgow book because I wanted to show a different side of Glasgow beyond the cliche. You know, I wanted to show that Glasgow had a bourgeoisie, a middle class, it was a cultural place, architecturally interesting, etc. Not just the usual perception of Glasgow as a working class city. And I thought, similarly, that we could look at Edinburgh anew through an anthology such as this. It's an anthology, but it tells a story. And I wanted to show the history of Edinburgh and some of the byways of the history that aren't so well known, and also to kind of try and capture the character of the city, show the city through its people. So not just the big events that kind of defined Edinburgh, but to kind of look at some of the people who, to my mind, are sort of Edinburghers, and to show, you know, what makes Edinburgh Edinburgh, what gives its characteristics.
Yeah, and can you maybe mention the structure of the book then? Because as you say, it's very similar in style to Glasgow, the Autobiography.
Yeah, well, it's chronological. You know, it takes us from the very earliest history of Edinburgh, some might say 900 years ago, although that's disputed, almost up to the present day, Edinburgh as now. And it goes through the sort of different phases of Edinburgh. I guess the kind of normal historical figures are there insofar as Mary, Queen of Scots is a big factor, John Knox is a big factor. But at the same time, I wanted to sort of illustrate the fact that Edinburgh has sort of two defining moments in its history. One is the Enlightenment and the building of the new town, and two, a couple of hundred years or so later on, the institution of the Edinburgh International Festival and the Fringe, which succeeded in rescuing Edinburgh from the sort of cultural doldrums, from being a very provincial grey city to a sort of modern European city that was kind of vibrant, a city that people flock to now in untold numbers.
And we'll talk about both those things later on. But first, I was interested in what sort of research it was involved with the book.
Well, I have quite a big library here at my house in the Borders. But I used, obviously, the kind of two main libraries in Edinburgh hugely. The Edinburgh Central Library, where I spent the early years of my working life. It's a place I know intimately. It used to have the Edinburgh Room, one of the sort of peerless collections of local history, but that's been subsumed into the Scottish department. And then just across the road, step away, the National Library of Scotland, one of the kind of truly great resources of this country. And so I could flip between both of those places. And of course, you know, having worked at the Scotsman newspaper as editor, deputy editor and managing editor there, you know, I was well aware of the kind of great history of the town inside its newspapers. So that was a very big resource as well. So I was kind of using all these sort of things. And also personal recommendations from friends. As I say, I was trying to build up Pontius like a portrait of Edinburgh, so that when you stood back, you could look at it and you could say, well, these are the great, huge events that happened in the city's history, but here are some of the interesting eccentrics and characters who actually lived there and contributed to what it is today.
I'm imagining at the beginning, in terms of time, there's not that much, so you're really kind of grasping onto every piece that's there, but then by the end you're almost having to edit things out to choose what to include because there's so much.
Absolutely, it's a really good question, because in the beginning you've not got an awful lot to go on. You have civic records and things like that, but they're not terribly interesting to read. A lot of them are written in arcane language that are not easy on the modern ear, but people are not crazy about them. And of course, as you get into the modern era, you've got a surfeit of stuff. But what in general happens, and what people kind of almost ignore when they're thinking about books like this, is A, they have a size limit. There can only be so many pages, so you have to pick and choose what you're going to have included. But also, you have to pay for stuff that's in copyright. Cool. So a budget is set for that, and you try to work within that. I was quite fortunate with a lot of the copyright stuff, because many of the people I included were known to me or were friends, and almost to a man and woman, they all waived their fees for it. So it was possible to produce a book such as this. But I think readers, normal readers, don't really think of these things. They think, oh, well, here's a book and you can just pick and choose what you want. Well, you can't just do that. You have to select stuff and you have to pay for it. And then sometimes you have to pay too much for it and you can't afford it. And that happened on 1 or 2 occasions.
Well, that's very interesting, because I hadn't even really considered that, but you're absolutely right. Of course, copyright would come into it in later years. Now, there's a lovely description of the city in the introduction by Hugh McDiarmid of Edinburgh as a mad God's dream. And I was wondering how you consider it. Well,
I consider it as that because, you know, especially the Old Town and the growing up of early Edinburgh, it seems to sort of explode. You know, famously, it's sitting on a volcano. And here was this kind of great eruption of building, which was the Old Town. And because space was constricted and no land was available for development or expansion, people had to live in the Old Town, and they lived, the only way they could was up. They had to build up. And so Edinburgh had the first tenements, Manhattan-like. Some of them were very, very tall. And the sort of high and low-born all lived in the same tenement. So you had the very wealthiest and the very poorest living cheek by jowl. And so it was a mad God's dream, because you think, crying out loud, no normal society lives like this. You know, everybody chucked into the mix, and that people, lords of the realm, were living with people who were actually living on nothing. I never met McDiarmid. I would like to have met McDiarmid, but you know, I met many friends of his and was friends of several of them. And that kind of Edinburgh, the Edinburgh that Hugh McDiarmid was very, very familiar with, was crazy. It was a wonderful, vibrant place to live. And alas, I think quite a lot of that has disappeared.
And we will talk a little bit about some individuals later, but am I right in thinking McDiarmid, while he was in the city, but he liked to get back down to the Langham himself? Yeah.
Oh yeah, he knew the bus timetable off by heart, and would often be poured onto the Langham bus. You know, he was a habitué of what are called the poets' pubs, but especially Milne's Bar, which was on Hanover Street and is still there, although they've taken the photographs of the poets down and have stored them somewhere in an attic, which is very much to be regretted. They make much of the history of the pub, but they don't show the pictures of the poets. And so for me, that was a kind of really first introduction to Edinburgh. It was a poet's city, a writer's city. And the poets' pubs with the Abbotsford just along the way, and the Café Royal just another step away across St Andrews Square, you know, was a wonderful kind of jousting place to be. You know, these guys were the city of literature that we now call Edinburgh. And I think it was a real city of literature then, a living city of literature then. And you knew where to find them. You knew where the poets would be. And if a poet didn't want to mingle with another poet, they had their own bar. And it was like sort of a sort of rival territory or gangland, that you wouldn't go and have a drink in Sandy Bell's, say, in Tollcross, because you knew a particular poet would be up there at that time. So you stuck to your own pub down in the New Town.
So it's sort of similar to some of the pubs in Glasgow where I am just now, where, you know, if you're of a certain footballing persuasion, you would never cross their door.
Exactly that. And, you know, Hamish Henderson, who I knew, Hamish was a habitué of Sandy Bell's, and Norman McCaig was a habitué of the Abbotsford. And there the twain met, and they didn't get on at all. And they were likely to come to some form of fisticuffs if they did. So it had all these kind of boundaries to it, the city. Although as a young person, I wasn't really aware of that. But and also there were things like Sandy Bell's was famous as a folk pub. Yeah. Well, certain people couldn't abide that. You know, Hamish, the minute he went into Sandy Bell's, began to sing. It was an incredible place.
So that kind of takes us on to something you referenced earlier on, and that's the stereotypes about both Edinburgh and, you know, about Glasgow as well. It's very interesting to compare the two, because I was thinking Edinburgh seems to remain in general more Morningside, Jenners and your poets' pubs, as opposed to Glasgow's Gorbals, what everyone wants, and the Sari Heed say, just to take.
Yes, yeah.
But there's a kind of, is that how Edinburgh kind of sees itself, do you think, as a more genteel place rather than its, you know, neighbours in the west?
Well, I think it sees itself as a kind of superior kind of place. While Glasgow is very happy to sort of say what it thinks about Edinburgh, Edinburgh's attitude to Glasgow is to ignore it, to think it doesn't exist. A number of years ago, I was coming over from Glasgow on the bus, and there were two Glasgow women sitting in the bus in front of me, and they hadn't met before, and they were of a certain age, maybe mid-50s, 60s. And I heard one woman saying, "So you've never been to Edinburgh before?" And my ears pricked up, and the woman said, "No, never been. This is my first visit." And the other one said, "So why is that? Why have you never been to Edinburgh before?" She said, "I never much saw the point of it." And I thought, that's fantastic. You've lived 60 years of your life in Scotland and you've never been to the capital. But yeah, to see Edinburgh through a sort of almost bourgeois view is the way to look upon it, because the bourgeois live in separate compartments, or layers of an onion. So the legal classes don't meet the academic classes, the clerical classes don't meet the banking classes. They're living in their own separate worlds. Right. And then, of course, to Edinburgh people now, postcodes really matter. Back in the day, it was kind of phone prefix numbers. So to have the 447 number prefix told people, without you having to tell them, that you lived in Morningside. I used to joke to Muriel Spark, Muriel was born and lived all her days in Edinburgh, in Bruntsfield. And I said, well, you know, Bruntsfield's a kind of limbo land, Muriel. You know, it's on the meadows, but, you know, it's neither here nor there. And I said, there are some people who sort of call it Lower Morningside. They are the snobby ones. And the ones who don't have the snobbish bone in their body would call it Upper Toll Cross. And so Edinburgh knows all about these hierarchies. And whereas Glasgow, as you say, have been defined by a kind of sectarianism, either through football, through religion, or whatever, in Edinburgh, it's schools. Schools are the kind of key driver to identifying where somebody is on the social hierarchy. And I have a couple of friends who are American, who went to a dinner party in the new town. And of course, the inevitable question came up, said, which school did you go to? And they said, oh, well, we're American. We brought up in, we didn't go to an Edinburgh school. They said, which school do your children go to? And they said, well, we don't have any children. So, you know, it's not really something that's come up. And then, though, when they thought they were off the hook, the person said to them, but what school would you send your children to if you had any children? So this was Edinburgh desperately trying to find out, you know, where somebody was on the social scale. And it's still like that, still very much like that.
I love how that question, exactly the same question, means such different things on different coasts, or certainly in different cities. It
does, yeah. Because if you had the word saint in front of your school name, it was a pretty key, you know, idea where you'd come from.
But I'm really interested that the Edinburgh stereotype then almost doesn't acknowledge the poverty that every city has and the kind of areas which struggle, whereas Glasgow almost doesn't acknowledge the wealthy areas, which are, as you say, are in the city, and you don't have to go too far to find them. And I think that's a really interesting comparison there. One seems to revel in their working past, their industrial past, and the other in their what you could widely call an intellectual past.
Yes, there is that. And, you know, there's other ways in which that manifests itself. I mean, for example, I lived in Glasgow in this merchant city for a while, and of an everyday working day, women especially went out dressed in their finery, whether it was just to go across the street and buy some carrots. They looked great. They wore their wealth on their backs. Edinburgh's idea of that is not to wear your wealth on the backs. You're a proper Edinburgh person if your clothes are rather down at heel. they say that, Edinburgh people inherit clothes from their forebears and are very happy to walk around in sort of distressed corduroys, and might even wear the long johns that they've inherited from somebody. They put their money into buildings, i.e. their houses, or schools. So 25% of the population of Edinburgh is educated at private school, which is a phenomenal number. No other city in the rest of the UK has that proportion. But yeah, it's a very interesting way that Glaswegians like to spend their money. Edinburgh people like to save it.
You said you stayed in the Merchant City. I lived in the Merchant City for a while, and those things you've spoken about do exist here. I remember some flats in Denniston being marketed as Merchant City East.
Yeah, yeah, they were, and I would sort of say, well, is that really the Merchant City? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, the distressing thing, of course, with Glasgow is that these sort of strides that they were making when the Merchant City was being renovated have kind of come to a halt, and Glasgow's not advancing in the way it could advance and should advance, and Edinburgh is absolutely booming.
Yeah, that is an interesting comparison, definitely. So before we go into some of the individuals, I want to talk about the extraordinary Enlightenment Edinburgh roughly around the 1760s, because some of the people who are living kind of very, very close to each other, I mean, it's astonishing, really, in terms of, I can't think of many cities who would have had these thinkers and doers at the same time.
No, nowhere like it. I mean, not even Paris in its heyday of the left bank. It had that kind of cultural melting pot hotspot, but it didn't have the sort of breadth of achievement that the Edinburgh and the Enlightenment had. And, it's really interesting to kind of figure out why you had the likes of David Hume, Adam Smith, James Hutton, Ramsay, you name it. Just every corner seemed to have a man of genius, as it was called. Yeah. And the chances of you bumping into men of genius were extraordinarily high because they were neighbours, and there were dozens of them. And many people have tried to explain how this came about. I personally think it was to do with the Scottish education system at that point, that by and large, a lot of people could be educated. I think competition was a huge thing. I think that if you have a man of genius living next door, you think, I can be a man of genius too. And so you're there to try and outdo your neighbour. And all kinds of stuff were sort of being tested at that particular time. Philosophy, science, medicine, writing, music, painting. Everybody who seemed to have a talent tried to push that right to the boundaries. And I think that's one of the most astonishing things that's happened anywhere in the world, that you had this incredible flowering of genius in this very small, very parochial backwater place up to that point. And of course, genius begets genius. People come to see what that genius is all about, how it's been here, and suddenly Edinburgh becomes a sort of tourist city up to a point in those days too, because everybody wants to see what is the place like that's engendering these people. They want to meet these people, and they want to walk around it and sort of savor the atmosphere. It's an amazing thing.
Almost like going to Los Angeles hoping to bump into some Hollywood star. Yeah. Was that idea that you could be in the same tavern as David Hume or something?
Well, if you were in Greenwich Village in the 60s, you'd hope to bump into Bob Dylan.
Yeah,
but
a better example, yeah.
Alas, and you could still do that even in the 90s when I was in New York and being in Greenwich Village. You see famous people wandering down the street and all this. So you didn't necessarily go and confront them. But in Edinburgh in the late 18th century, there was a fair chance that you were going to meet these people. People like Walter Scott, incredible celebrities.
Yeah.
At that time, everybody came north or for further flung places to meet Scott. I live near his house at Abbotsford. The visitors book there was absolutely amazing. Yeah. And he was in Edinburgh. He was known as an Edinburgh man. He was the best-selling author of his day. Everybody wanted to meet him, but he was not alone. And therefore, it was very difficult for these people to lord it over one another. They were constantly testing each other's talents.
And Burns was drawn there as well, wasn't it?
Burns was drawn there and celebrated. And, I think the women were sort of falling over themselves to meet Burns. Yeah, and Scott met Burns very briefly and managed to finish a quote for him, as was Scott's wont. I think it would have been wonderful to have met Burns in Edinburgh and just have got a kind of flavour of what kind of man he was. And, you know, Edinburgh tried to patronise him, but rather unsuccessfly. You know, it was Henry Mackenzie that called him a heaven, was it a heaven-sought ploughman or whatever it was?
Yeah. And were there people and events that you were surprised by when you were writing the book, or did you kind of know roughly all of these things?
Well, I knew roughly all of these things. You know, it was finding interesting pieces that sort of exemplified them. You know, that I kind of knew that, and I was a bit surprised sometimes by the number of people who'd come to Edinburgh and were taken by it and their reaction to it. You know, that it wasn't all wonderful, that they would arrive and they'd come to the Grassmarket, you know, the Wordsworths, for example, or the Shelleys or whoever, and they stay in some dive, and, you know, it was all pretty grim, and the service was dirty. And, you know, Dr. Johnson came and he thought, you know, the sort of the quality, the hotel trade was poor. But once they sort of ventured out of that, then they began to kind of see the point of it. They would sort of suddenly think, look at this, look at these buildings, look at what's going up. Because it must have been a bit like Berlin after the wall came down and Berlin began to rebuild. You know, it used to be called a city of cranes. Well, there weren't cranes in the late 18th century, but it must have just been a ferment of building as well. You know, you were living in the midst of a huge building site. As they sort of expanded into the new town. And, you know, the new town wasn't built, for example, Alistair, overnight. It took decades to build it. And there was a lot of controversy, because that's another Edinburgh theme, stopping things happening. You know, Edinburgh is fantastic at stopping things happening. Glasgow is not fantastic at stopping things happening. That's why terrible things have been perpetrated on the city of Glasgow, that for whatever reason, Glasgow's middle class haven't been good at preventing excrescences visited upon the city.
So the new town's very interesting. I mean, how did that change the city's personality, and how was it reported and received?
Well, first of all, people didn't really want it, because, you know, everything was located in the old town, and there was a shopkeeper who was one of the kind of architects of the whole thing, and he wanted to build a road down from the old town into the new town, that which has become the Mound. And irony upon ironies, when it was accepted, they had to bulldoze through his shop. So he lost his shop. But they sort of, the new town gave Edinburgh its Jekyll and Hyde character. Suddenly, the poor were left behind in the old town, and the wealthy, the well-to-do, bourgeoisie went to the new town, because the air was cleaner, the apartments were bigger, and there was facilities they could only dream about in the old town. And suddenly Edinburgh became very much a kind of apartheid city, that the poor were left behind and the wealthy got into the new town. It's not so much the same today. It costs quite a lot to live in the old town, but if you could afford an apartment in the new town, you're doing okay, I think.
And just something that struck me that's in the book, you said about Edinburgh being very good at stopping things, and there's proposals at some point to put buildings on the other side of Princes Street, which of course would have stopped that fantastic vista up to the castle. And that's a great example of that.
Oh, absolutely. You know, that's within my memory. I remember council officials setting up exhibitions in Princes Street, telling us how it would look. And there would be a sort of walkway, and there would be shops and all the rest of it. The fact that it would obscure one of the great iconic views of the world never seems to have occurred to these idiots. Then there was, in the 1960s, the plan to build an incredible ring road, which would have bulldozed through much of Edinburgh's kind of great heritage, with tunnels under Cotland Hill, roads on stilts going across the meadows, you know, you name it. And, you know, that plan got quite far down the road before suddenly, you know, the bourgeoisie rose and said, come on,
Yeah.
And the pages of the Scotsman, the letters pages of the Scotsman, were full of people just venting their fury about this. And eventually it was called in by the Secretary of State, and he looked at it and it just basically said, "You have to be joking. This cannot happen." And that was one of the reasons it was said why Edinburgh has never voted Tory since. From the 1960s to today, there has not been a Tory administration in Edinburgh. But another, wonderful example of Edinburgh stopping things was the proposal to move the National Portrait Gallery from Queen Street to Glasgow, which was a proposal by Timothy Clifford, the then director of the National Galleries, and my old pal Sir Angus Grossart, who was the chairman of the trustees of the galleries. And they decided this would be a good idea. Move the Portrait Gallery from Queen Street in the middle of Edinburgh, in the middle of the new town, to Glasgow. I have never seen fury like it brought down upon two men. I went to the public meeting in Edinburgh at the art school, and Clifford had the courage to turn up. And there were more blue rinses and new club members there you could count. It was absolutely packed to the gunnels. And he was very lucky not to be torn limb from limb. And that just died that night. It died that night. That was the end of it.
That's fascinating.
So they're very good at stopping things. And, they get tied up in all kinds of things. The new town's full of lots of wonderful regulations about what you can and can't do there to your buildings. And then there's another kind of small theme in the book was dogs. Like Edinburgh, of course, cares much more for dogs, certainly, than women. My daughter was living in Trinity, which is a nice part of Edinburgh, and there was a private park there where you have to have keys to get into. Another feature of Edinburgh life. There's lots of private parks. And she, the kids would go there and play, but there were all these large dogs roaming. So she said to the person who was the convener of the parks, "Look, can we not do something for the children to make sure that they're not mauled by these dogs?" And he said, "Sure, we'll look into it." And in this huge park, they built a sort of small fenced area off for the children. And the rest of the park was allowed for the dogs to roam. Typical Edinburgh.
So they caged the children and
they caged the children, and the dogs could roam. It was like the Serengeti. Here's a little cell for the kind of animal hunters, and there's the animals out there roaming wild.
Oh, that's brilliant. And we mentioned Scott and Burns, but you said it's a city of literature. Scott, Stevenson, Oliphant, Conan Doyle, Spark, these are all mentioned there. The poets' pubs of Rose Street, and even J.K. Rowling, they've really shaped the city.
Yeah, and Ian Rankin and Sandy McCall Smith, etc. There's another aspect of this that while Glasgow exists to get its hands dirty and build things for us, Edinburgh burghers do not want to get dirt under their fingernails. These are white-collar people with pens in their hands, and it's very much a kind of paper-driven city. And so it's not surprising that it was a kind of writer's city. But when you have, for example, someone like Walter Scott, who's become a great international bestseller, critically and popularly, and other people want to be like him. This sets an example. And Glasgow, for all its very good writers, especially in the kind of modern era, has never had anybody like that. There's never been anybody like that in Glasgow. So Stevenson's not like Scott, but he knew all about Scott.
Yeah.
Muriel Spark is not at all like Stevenson, but she knew all about Stevenson. She knew where he lived. She knew the stories, etc. And so one engenders another, and that's what happens.
There's a lineage which kind of runs through, and yeah. And
it's like if if you tell children, if there's a model for children, and they say, "Oh well, look, you can do that because so and so does it. Look, you can do this," and off they go. The fact that J.K. Rowling lives in the city is quite something. But one of the most extraordinary things is the number of people who come to Edinburgh because of J.K. Rowling. It's there are huge sort of crocodiles of Japanese and Chinese wandering Edinburgh's High Street and the Royal Mile and the Georgeford Bridge looking for hints of J.K. Rowling. It's incredible.
Yeah, because if you go to Edinburgh outside of the festival, you think, well, what's going on here? This looks like it should be part of a festival.
Yeah.
But actually, that's exactly what's going on.
That's what's going on. And, you know, people are making a good living taking folk on tours daily. You know, it's hard to understand to me. You know, writing and reading are private things. I don't want to go on tours with people, but they do.
No, absolutely not. But that kind of brings us to the Edinburgh Festival itself and its influence on the city and ramifications.
Well, I mean, it was an inspired idea, you know, in 1946, to have an international festival of culture in Edinburgh, with a globe completely torn apart by the war and divided. And so its early advocates were determined that part of it would be a sort of a healing. It would have a healing element to it, that people would come from all parts to rejoice in culture, something that they could share a common bond in. And you know, you have to take your hat off to the people who dreamt it up. You know, there was the then Lord Provost, for example, the then editor of the Scotsman, a representative for the British Council, and I think it was the Earl of Rosebery's, Lady Rosebery's. She was very keen on culture, and it said that her husband had a good win with one of his horses on the Grand National, and he gave her some of the winnings to help give seed money to get the festival off the ground. And then it had the inspirational idea of bringing in Rudolf Bing, who, an Austrian Jew, who had a very good track record, especially with music. And he managed to sort of bring people to Edinburgh at a time when, you know, that was not easy.
Yeah.
But then Edinburgh had the thing that no other city had, the sort of natural, theatrical, dramatic setting. That it was a small, compact city, people could move around. And if they weren't at events, they were still outdoors inside a theatre. It was incredible. And I think that was the first realization for many people in the modern era that, wow, what is this city? Because you cannot fail to be inspired by seeing that Castle Rock and the Castle Rise as you come into Edinburgh. If that doesn't hit you right in the heart, I don't know what city can do that to you. No, I'm a lover of Florence. And it's a sister city of Edinburgh, and you know, it looks wonderful, but it doesn't have Edinburgh's drama.
I would completely agree with that, absolutely. But it does seem to me that people who live in Edinburgh have a complicated relationship, perhaps more recently, with the festival. Well,
you know, it was said that they leave the city so that they can make some money out of people staying there. I'm not, you know, some people do that. Some people make money out of Airbnbs, and you know, well, that's up to them. But I think too much is made of that. Edinburgh wouldn't have tolerated a festival all these decades if they didn't have great fondness for it. And I think surveys have shown that Edinburgh people go to festival things in huge numbers and invest lots of money in going to them. You know, they're very faithful festival goers. And the festival has provided Edinburgh with story beyond stories. I mean, you know, when I was at the Scotsman, our idea was to review everything on the fringe. You know, it was a military operation. And we had reviewers going from dawn till dusk, reviewing things, and then right through the night. And then, of course, you've got all these wonderful, eccentric, odd people, inspired artists and all that, coming to Edinburgh and letting them do their own thing. They felt unleashed, and young people felt this was a kind of great rite of passage. That you know, you had to go to the Edinburgh Festival as an 18 or 19-year-old, and this was, in a way, you're leaving home. It was better than university. And honestly, the number of strange and wonderful and weird things that have happened in the festival that I've witnessed is incredible. We had a guy called Zenya Hamada, who's a Japanese gentleman who had made an absolute fortune building replica golf courses in Japan. You know, he would build the old course and things like that in Japan. But what he really wanted to be was a playwright. And he wrote plays with sort of modest titles like Genius and stuff like that. And he turned up at the Scotsman one day and asked to be able to take a page ad out for his play, which was hardly getting any visitors and no reviews. And we said, no, I'm sorry, the paper's full today, you can't actually. And he just clicked open his briefcase and there were wadges of notes, 50,000 quid or whatever. And so, of course, you suddenly change your mind and you're able to find him a page. And he went on to found an amazing prize for the best event at the festival. He left several million with a couple of Edinburgh lawyers who never used to go to the festival. And after that, they had to go to every event at the festival they could because they were part of the judging process for this fantastic prize. And then he just disappeared off the face of the earth. Disappeared off the face of the earth.
Amazing.
And then, then I was involved personally with the early days of the book festival. And, it was absolutely incredible, the people we could bring to the festival. James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, Gore Vidal, John Updike, you name it. These were the sort of the greatest of the great coming to Edinburgh. I have a very fond memory of basically a marquee, the kind of marquee that we used to go to BB Camp with. And there was Anthony Burgess giving a lecture on, I don't know what, some kind of musical thing he was doing. And I just looked at the back of the hall standing. There was John Updike listening to Anthony Burgess giving a lecture. And the best event at the book festival I ever witnessed was when we invited Hunter S. Thompson to come to the book festival, and he didn't come because he got lost. Well, he got driven by a kind of drunk guy on the way to the airport, and never made it. And there we were all, and his publisher had come from New York. We were all there waiting in the new town with all these Hells Angels who were fans of his, waiting for Hunter to turn up. He never came, and it was the greatest event ever in the history of the book festival because it was reported front page news the whole country over.
Yeah, because it is in the book as well, that Hunter S. Thompson's own words about it.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's just wonderful that there he is. Hunter himself is completely mad. I managed to get him because I was friendly with Ralph Steadman, who had done a wonderful edition, illustrated a wonderful edition of Treasure Island. And I'd got Ralph to come to inaugurate the first Robert Louis Stevenson supper, and of which much rum was consumed, but not much food. And I remember Ralph giving the kind of oration at that, reading from a roll of toilet paper. It was, it was fantastic. And when Hunter didn't come, Ralph felt that he had to do something to mark this extreme event. And we went to a restaurant and he set fire to a T-shirt, and the whole restaurant had to be evacuated.
And that was one of the stories I was thinking of that I was surprised to find was the Hunter S. Thompson. Another was Kenneth Tynan.
Yeah.
And he comes across the young girl outside the shop, which just says... The
prostitute, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean...
It sums up a part of Edinburgh, and perhaps, but it's still kind of an unlikely story, I think.
Well, it's interesting that the prostitution or sex working or whatever we call it now, was quite a big deal in Edinburgh. That going back to the days of James Boswell, these sort of sons of lairds and all the rest of it, had a license to basically do what they wanted in the old town, and they would spend all day drinking, and then he would go with some woman he'd met on the way home. And then he'd go to his house and tell his wife this had happened. And he'd be full of remorse, saying he'd never do it again. And then, sure enough, did it all again the next day. But, that was in the 18th century, but it goes right into the 20th century, of course, with Edwin Muir taking visitors from Eastern Europe on a walkabout at Edinburgh and finding the sort of prostitutes at the top of Leith Walk and women fighting with one another. And again, there was that interesting sort of little line, whereas when you leave Princes Street and head off down towards Leith Walk, you leave safety and you enter the sort of danger zone. And as Irving Welsh said, the further down the walk you go, the more likely you are to get a punch in the mouth. And that's changing too now,
very much so.
As Leith Walk becomes, in a way, gentrified in the way that it might anyway.
And there's one person I have to ask you about, because this did surprise me. In the section College for the Deaf and Dumb, November 1773, yes. Samuel Johnson talks about a gentleman called Braidwood, which is my surname.
Yes, of course, yes.
I see a lot of Braidwoods around. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Well, he was the founder of a school for young people who were deaf and dumb. And he had a sort of innovative method for teaching them. And he's clearly, I don't know much about him personally, but he's clearly an inspirational individual who, again, in the spirit of the Enlightenment times, I thought, well, how can we bring education to people who can't speak, can't hear? And that was the beginning of, say, Donaldson's School for the Deaf, which went on to become a very celebrated place in Edinburgh. But Johnson was as impressed by that as he was by a lot of the other stuff of the other so-called men of genius he was meeting in the Old Town. He was thinking, well, I've never seen anything like this anywhere else in any of my travels, and I've never heard anything else about it. So there's all these little pockets of things happening too.
And there's lots of those throughout the book, just that are maybe not quite unexpected, but give the bigger picture, as you say, give a really full picture of the city. Has it changed your view on the city through writing it, or has it confirmed what you always kind of knew?
Well, it's kind of confirmed it. I mean, I was kind of taken by how epochal these two events were, the Enlightenment and the festival, and that in between was just sort of mortar. That Edinburgh went through poor periods, bad periods, stasis, parochialism, snobbishness, etc. Muriel Spark said, she left it when she was 18, and Muriel said, this was a city that could not possibly understand me. And so that's in the late 1920s, early 1930s. It would be later, 1937, thereabouts. It was a place that could not possibly understand me, and I was always struck by that. I thought, what was wrong? Well, she always said that when she saw the film of The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie, which again is set 1929, 1930, that they got it wrong. It was a very celebrated film, of course, but they got it wrong because Edinburgh was never that colourful. It was a grey, dull, overcast city in her memory, and that by Hollywood brightening it up and giving it colour, it was an inaccurate portrait of Edinburgh. And I've always been struck by that as well, that Edinburgh really was a grey city, but it's got less and less grey. The buses used to be a dark maroon colour. Now, God, they're a smack you in the face green or whatever. There can be anything, as long as they're advertising something. And that has changed in my lifetime. That it was also a very smoky city, as everywhere was. But Edinburgh was more so because of the smoke belching out of Waverley Station, the almost smelly smoke of the breweries, and there were dozens of breweries in Edinburgh, and then all the buildings were covered in grime. So in my early years of Edinburgh, it was a dark city. It's no more a dark city. It's funny, I have sort of nostalgia for the dark city. I sort of hanker after these evenings. I think in the introduction I say, going down on a snowy evening from the reference library in George Forthbridge where I worked to meet Norman McCaig for a glass or two before closing time. It was an empty city too. There was nobody there. It's never empty now. It's always heaving.
Yeah, and going back to Jekyll and Hyde, the kind of feel of Jekyll and Hyde was almost what you've just described. I feel the kind of smoky, foggy, who knows what's around the corner.
Yeah.
Edinburgh had that feel about it.
Yeah, you just didn't know. That sort of clandestine, slightly dangerous kind of place. Well, I suppose pubs were like that in those days, that you never knew who you might be drinking alongside. And you went to places that, could cope with that kind of stuff. And certainly in sort of my newspaper time at the Scotsman, I did a quick computation, and within a 5-minute walk of the Scotsman, Brisk Walk, you could be within 30 pubs. I mean, within 5 seconds, Alistair, you could be in 2 pubs, the Halfway House and the Jingle and Geordie. And another 10 seconds, and then there was the Malt Shovel and the Scotsman Lounge and goodness knows what else. It was absolutely incredible. It was no wonder that journalists were alcoholic. And you tried.
That was the main reason.
Yeah, you tried to go to pubs where you wouldn't be caught all night. well, famously, the Jingling Geordie has a sort of narrow bit from the bar, and then there's a little bit that opens up. It's shaped like a key almost. And if you got caught in the round part of the key, it was very difficult to get out, because I'd run a gauntlet of pals, and you'd be saying cheerio all night. And there were so many pubs; it was incredible.
So do you plan, do you think, to write any future autobiographies of other Scottish cities?
Definitely not.
That's very definite.
No, I mean, you know, it has been suggested that I might do other cities, not in Scotland, but you know, that would be extraordinarily presumptuous. Imagine me doing a book about Dublin. You know, you'd just be run out of town. No, I'm writing a memoir, a sort of name-dropping memoir. So I'm not sure what will happen with that. And I might do something else. I'm not even sure what's next. I spent 2 years of lockdown editing Alan Rickman's diaries. Yeah. And, you know, that was enjoyable, but I don't want to do that either. You know, when you get to a certain stage in life, you've got to be careful about what you spend your time on. And so whatever I do, the memoir is probably uppermost in my mind right now.
Oh, well, I look forward to that. But I really did enjoy Edinburgh, the autobiography, and I'm sure other people will as well. Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
No, it was lovely talking to you, Alistair. Stay well.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.